Hi, everyone. In our 22nd series of famous quotes on Paul, we've been covering Hermann Detering, and he has written a book called The Fabricated Paul in 2018. The subtitle is Early Christianity in the Twilight, and this is largely predicated on an article he wrote back in 1996 in the Journal of Historical Criticism, and the article was called The Dutch Radical Approach to the Pauline Epistles. And the basic conclusion is stated there at the bottom. Clementine literature is historical on Peter and James' final view of Paul. So people who tell you that Second Peter is the definitive final view of of Peter about Paul, the answer is no. And we have historical records of how they actually viewed both James and Peter viewed Paul, as we'll see. Now, I just want to give you some background. So here's an article I had online about Hermann Detering for over a decade, and it reads as follows. Many scholars concur that Simon Magus in the Ebionite influenced works such as the Clementine Homolies, sometimes misleadingly referred to as the pseudo-Clementine Homilies, I'll explain that in a second, represent a name replacement for Paul, or as Roberts calls it, the cipher. For when you see Simon Magus in the Clementine literature, that's a cipher for the name Paul. So it just simply Rufinus was the corrupter of the Clementine Homilies after they were very popular and very well liked in the early church. He, in the late 300s, corrupted them by taking them all, completely translating them, and then destroying all the original Syriac and the original Greek versions of them. So Rufinus is the final author, and therefore that's why they're called the pseudo-Clementine Homilies. But that's also at the same time misleading because in his uh, uh, view of what he needed to corrupt about Paul and Peter and James was simply what the name was, who James and Peter are talking about, and removing that name. But we can see a lot of the reasons why they're parallel and why a scholar like Mr. Detering, Pastor Detering, concluded that is historical when we're talking about the accounts about Peter, James, and Paul. Okay, so let's continue. The purpose of Rufinus was to protect Paul from embarrassment of what the Clementines in the early church recorded as part of the history of Paul. The Berlin pastor, Hermann Detering, born in 1953, believes these works are actually historical accounts of the life of Paul, and thus it demonstrates Peter went to Rome not to work with Paul so much as to confront him, as the Wikipedia article on Hermann Detering explains. Quote, many scholars, since Ferdinand Christian Bauer in the 19th century, have concluded that the attacks on Simon Magus in the 4th century pseudo-Clementines may be attacks on Paul, period. I just want to pause there. Uh, Rufinus did his fraudulent rewrite in the 4th century, in the late 300s. Again, he did this to Origen's works, did the same thing, and they've been exposed more recently where we can see all the works of Origen were destroyed and corrupted to advance the latest Christology of the Roman Catholic Church in the late 300s. And yet Origen's original works from the 200s were totally had a different Christology than was purported to be the Christology of Origen in the 200s. So we have the same issue here. We have the Clementines are now called pseudo because we know that Rufinus is willing to corrupt them, but you have to know where his biases lay and what kind of corruptions he'll make. So Christian Bauer was saying, look, we can just see if you just remove the word Simon Magus and put in the word Paul, it makes perfect sense. It fits everything we know about him from Paul's epistles. So we can see through clearly Rufinus had a cipher, they called it. Scholars call it a cipher. So he could tell people, well, anytime I say the word Simon Magus, I'm really talking about Paul. But you know what? It's embarrassing. So we're going to conceal it, and then I'm going to destroy all the original versions of the Clementine Homilies, which he was very effective at doing, and he got rid of all of them. Maybe there's one Syriac version floating around. I have to find that. Some people claim there is one, but the bottom line is pseudo Clementines is unfortunately technically accurate, but still at the same time we can see through what's the change, what is the falsehood that Rufinus did, just like he did to Origen. We can see exactly through what his motives and purposes were to change Christology. In this case, he just wanted to protect Paul, so he didn't have to change everything about it, about the text. So you'll see, particularly in the letter of Peter to James, there's a very clear reference to Paul, but without using his name. And probably they didn't even have to use his name because they knew who they were talking about. So let's continue. Detering takes the attacks of the Clementines, I'm just going to call it Clementines, with that proviso that you understand it's it's modified by Rufinus, as literal and historical. So that's what Detering is saying. We should take it literal and historically, okay, knowing full well what Rufinus's biases are, and suggest that the attacks of the Clementines are correct in making Simon Magus a proxy for Paul of Tarsus, with Paul originally having been detested by the church. Okay, and that's something that we now know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, documents in there called the Habakkuk Pesher, dated paleologically by neutral experts, is 50 A.D. So this is 20 years before the temple falls. So that's why Golb is correct that the Dead Sea Scrolls were secreted out through the Hadrian's tunnel underneath the temple over, and where does it land? It lands over the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you follow the path out of the temple, the secret tunnel, you'll get all the way there, and you can imagine what the library of the temple would be. It would be all these books, multiple copies of Isaiah make sense now, and different divergent viewpoints of the people writing books or epistles, or what do you want to call them, very small documents. They're all different viewpoints at all. And then the Catholic Church suppressed this from us because there was a very clear problem. They could see the Habakkuk Pesher staring them at the face, and it's about the Ebion. It talks about the Ebion, the original name of the original church. And it talked about the enemy and the spouter of lies, and the confronting with the Zadik, which means the just one, and that would signify James the Just in anyone's mind who knew the literature of that era. So they had to suppress it for 40 years, and only Eisenman broke it out from their hands in the mid 1990s, and he is the one who's exposed the Habakkuk Pesher to us. But of course, the Catholic Church has been very effective at blocking us, any of us seeing it, and there was no interest on the Protestant Church either to show you that Paul is talked about negatively in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I digress. Let's continue. Let's read this over again. Many scholars since Ferdinand Bauer in the 19th century have concluded that the attacks on Simon Magus in the 300s book the Clementines, may be attacks on Paul. Detering takes the attacks of the Clementines as literal and historical, and suggests that the attacks of the Clementines are correct in making Simon Magus a proxy for Paul of Tarsus, with Paul originally having been detested by the church. That's what I just discussed. And the name changed when Paul was rehabilitated by virtue of forged epistles correcting the genuine ones. So what he is saying is that the name was changed from being a negative. So now Paul's now a positive in the 380s, right? Because you've got to get rid of Sabbath, and Paul's the only one who's going to get rid of Sabbath, and that's what Constantine ordered in 321 AD as a matter of law on all the people of the Roman Empire. So now with Paul having to be rehabilitated, you had to change the name from Paul, or any reference to Paul, to Simon Magus, and that's why it was changed. Okay. Now, next, this is my article continuing. Detering's arguments expands beyond the Clementines to include other apocrypha, the letter of Peter to James. I should make a correction about that. Is the letter of Peter to James is inside most publications of the Clementines, okay? But technically, the way it was presented originally is there was a letter of Peter to James, there was the book of Clementines, and when Rufinus did his rework, he put these things together because he was trying to collect all the Ebionite writing into one place, rewrite it or change it as he needed to do, and he'd have it all in one place. Therefore, he could send out his missionaries to go and to grab all the originals and destroy all of them so people can't know exactly what it originally said. Very malicious person of history, if you ask me. So Detering arguments expands beyond the Clementines to include other apocrypha, such as the letter of Peter to James, arguing that Simon Magus is sometimes described in this apocryphal literature in terms that would fit Paul, though most significantly does so in the Clementine recognitions and homilies. But he also points out the letter of Peter to James is a key document to look at. And we're going to review that today. I'm going to quote that to you today, show it to you today, show you how also to get these documents yourselves. Detering contends that the common source of these documents are as early as the 1st century and must have consisted in a polemic against Paul emanating from the Jewish side of Christianity, the Ebion. Paul being thus identified with Simon Magus, Detering argues that Simon Magus' visit to Rome in the Clementines had no other basis than Paul's presence there, and further that the tradition of Peter's residence in Rome rests on the assumed necessity of his resisting the archenemy of Judaism, of early Christianity is the correct thing I should have said, there as elsewhere. Thus, according to Detering, the idea of Peter at Rome really originated with the Ebionites, but it was afterwards taken up by the Catholic Church, and then Paul was associated with Peter in opposition to Simon, who had originally been Paul himself. Rufinus created a revised Clementine literature to allow for such myth and hero worship to turn toward Paul. Hence, Peter and Paul were not allies at Rome because the Clementines depict a confrontation between Simon Magus, that's Rufinus's cipher for Paul, and Peter in Rome. And Detering defends that the Clementines are historical and not fictional accounts. He means that Paul was rehabilitated later in Constantine's era. The Clementines were edited to change Paul to Simon Magus. This makes sense once you read the Clementines and recognize the individual Simon Magus can be no other than Paul in various discrete places. All right, so now let's read from the fabricated Paul or the falsified Paul. The original German title probably meant falsified Paul, Early Christianity in the Twilight by Mr. Detering, Pastor Detering. This is from page 3 or location 3297 of the Kindle version of this book. And he says this: without doubt, against the identity of Simon and Paul seems to stand, first of all, the banal circumstance that Paul certainly does not mean Simon, or that Simon does not mean Paul, and that the different names seem to refer to different persons. However, precisely with regard to Paul and Simon, this argument is of very dubious value, since it is generally known that already within early Christian literature itself, there is a branch where this distinction indeed is not carried out, and where Simon in fact stands in place of Paul, i.e. is identified with Paul. This would be the so-called pseudo-Clementines and the Charagmata Petro, which I just was telling you, the letter of Peter to James, or the preaching of Peter, you could call it as well, associated with them, coming out of the Jewish Christian Ebionite circles. The complete identification of Simon-Paul found there one of the most difficult problems of the New Testament scholarship, working until now with the assumption of the authenticity for the Pauline letters, certainly represents one of the strongest arguments for the identity thesis presented here. One certainly should not oversimplify the problem associated with the pseudo-Clementine literature, which is significantly named after Clement, the Roman bishop, the third follower of Peter in Rome. Nevertheless, I believe that the basic problem here can be fairly well stated with the following formulas. 1. In the pseudo-Clementines, Simon is known and opposed by name. 2. The heresies ascribed to him are Marcionite, meaning pro-Paul. Faith alone and all the doctrines that we should know from Marcionism by this time. 3. Even more strange, the words that are placed in his mouth are those of Paul. So you'll see words exactly verbatim from Paul are in these writings, but they're attributed to Simon Magus. But that's only because of what Rufinus did, is by replacing Paul's name with Rufinus. Rufinus replacing Paul's name with the name Simon Magus. There are a number of solutions for this problem in my book, and I don't know German, so I'll just try the best I can. Paulus briefe one Paulus, ? I described in detail the Tübingen solution, which saw Simon as a characterization of Paul, and today the problem is usually solved in complicated literary ways. However, there is still another much simpler solution that has not been considered until now. Why do we not understand the pseudo-Clementines in a completely literal way? Why do we not take seriously the fact that the writer of this Jewish anti-Pauline literature, Paul, is in fact no one else than Simon? I mean, in other words, you're saying Simon equals Paul. Let's just get rid of our pretensions that they're different. No, they're the same person. The word there should just be rendered as Paul in your mind, and that's how you should understand it. Now, this is important. If words from Galatians are placed there in the mouth of Simon, 207. So if you go over to the Clementine Homolies, chapter 17, subparagraph 19, you will see the words of Galatians 2:1. Therefore, you can see that this is not an accident. These words are deliberately pointing at an epistle of Paul, and therefore the original name wasn't Simon Magus in the same sentence, it was Paul. It wouldn't make sense. What is the chance that Simon Magus is using identical expressions that Paul uses, and they're very specific to a situation. Let's continue. Or if he is portrayed as a missionary to the Gentiles like Paul. So Simon Magus is not trying to reach Jews. He's trying to do exactly what Paul does in the Clementine Homilies. Well, what's the best explanation of that? Rufinus changed the word Paul to Simon Magus. Therefore, we can change it back. Who converted the Gentiles to Christianity before Peter? Okay, so that's how Simon Magus would like to view that he had gotten to places where Peter had not gotten yet, and that's exactly how Paul made it look like he was going to places that had not been reached yet by Peter. Then It says this. This is important. I'm gonna digress into this to show you something very important. What about in the Epistola Petri, the letter of Peter to James? There's a reference made to someone who is, quote, in hardly, it says, a reference was made in a hardly concealed attitude to the lawless and foolish teaching of a hostile man. Now, to truly appreciate that, we need to go out and look at the epistle of Peter to James. I just want to show you here is if you wanted to get it online through Kindle, you can just go purchase Mr. Stephen Missick's book, The Ascent of James. And in there at page 96, he has the epistle of Peter to James. But we're going to show you another source, which you can get free online from Google, books.google.com. All right, so I'm going to put online or in the description to this video, a link to my Airtable where you can download this volume of the Ante-Nicene Christian Library. You see here the subheading of under volume 17, it says the Clementine Homolies. Okay, and then you'll be able to read all of the epistle of the letter of Peter to James and all the Clementine Homilies as Rufinus changed them, as they exist in his form, okay? So let's read from page 2 of this text here. And this is Peter telling James something. And this I know, not as being a prophet, but as already seeing the beginning of this very evil. For some from among the Gentiles have rejected my legal preaching, attaching themselves to certain lawless and trifling preaching of the man who is my enemy. I'm going to pause there. If you now go look at the Habakkuk Pesher that Professor Eisenman exposed, the Catholic Church had suppressed all these works that you would know who they were really from. Paleographically, they've been now dated to 50 AD, meaning they are contemporary with James and Peter and Paul. And this doesn't have to do with Eisenman. This is scholars independent of him already determined they're from 50 AD. They're in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This fits the Golb thesis that the Dead Sea Scrolls are simply the Library of Jerusalem being secreted out through Hadrian's Tunnel, which leads all the way down to the Dead Sea area where it was found. So anyway, let's continue here. So the word enemy is a reference repeatedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Habakkuk Pesher in particular. The enemy is clearly called the spouter of lies and matches somebody who has an identical view of Habakkuk 2 verse 4, as does Paul twice in his epistles, and is opposed by the Habakkuk Pesher in the Dead Sea Scrolls, taking the view that it's faithfulness or obedience that is what justifies. Let's resume reading. And these things some have attempted while I am still alive to transform my words by certain various interpretations, in order to the dissolution of the law, as though I also myself were of such a mind, but did not freely proclaim it, which God forbid. For such a thing were to act in opposition to the law of God, which was spoken by Moses, and was borne witness to by our Lord in respect of its eternal continuance. For thus he spoke, quote, the heavens and the earth shall pass away, but one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law. And this he has said, that all things might come to pass. But these men, professing I know not how to know my mind, undertake to explain my words, which they have heard of me more intelligently than I who spoke them, telling their catechumens that this is my meaning, which indeed I never thought of. But if, while I am still alive, they dare thus to misrepresent me, how much more will those who shall come after me dare to do so? I hope you can see, if you were Peter and you're being misrepresented, that you're lawless as Paul is totally lawless, and you're faithful to Jesus Christ, saying the law is eternal for all generations, and the heaven and earth have to pass away before the law goes away. Do you see the anger that you would literally have? And there's total justification, and there's total rejection of everything you've been told that you should believe, because you're going to trust Paul. He's not trusting Paul. This is Peter, the follower of Jesus Christ, the person who Jesus said, God gave you this message that I'm the Messiah. Remember that when he said, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom. He literally did say that. I'm not saying I believe in the Pope idea, but he was given the power at that time in his generation to be that person who could say who's in and who's out of the club. And this other voice, his enemy, is out of the club. Let's just put it that way, out of the society of polite company, so to speak, because of his apostasy. So by this point in time, Peter and James are totally aware that Paul is an apostate. If you look at Acts 21:21, and you'll see James heard rumors. We've heard rumors that you're an apostate. The word in Greek there is apostasia. You have to go look at Mount's reverse interlinear. You will see the word apostasy. That means you are someone who teaches contrary to God's law, that it is faded away, it's a tutor, whatever descriptions you want to describe the law. Peter is saying it's continuous for all generations. As Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away before the law goes away. This is definitely supported by Jesus' words and totally inimical to Paul anyway, even if you didn't know this passage. But doesn't this confirm you and strengthen you to understand that the early church were following Jesus' words? They had not been convinced and thought that Paul was teaching correctly, that the law was a tutor and going away. And not only that, Peter is relying upon the word of God. He says, this is what it says in the law of Moses, that it's eternal. It says it 27 plus times, my friends. It says it's eternal for all generations, or everlasting for all generations. So Peter is standing on a rock, and everybody who stands on Paul's foundations is standing on sand. That's how Jesus describes this kind of contrast. All right, so I'm going to end it there. I've given you a little bit of reference to where you can find more about the Clementine Homilies. You'll look in the description to this video. You'll see a link. Follow that link. Just download the PDF. You'll now have not only the Epistle of Peter, the Ascent of James also, but also the Clementine Homilies. And that is going to be a life changer. If you read them, you're going to go, oh my gosh, this is telling us from the apostolic angle, from the angle we never hear, that's been suppressed, which was popular and very well read in the early church. But Rufinus in the late 380s had to destroy it for a variety of reasons. It was anti-Paul, and it was pro-Jesus says what he says in John 17, 1-3. The Father is the only true God. They were going to stick by whatever Jesus taught and not follow anybody who came along and tried to claim there's some other role that Jesus played other than the Father dwelling in him, and every word, every logos he speaks is not mine, it's from the Father. That's this group. They were solid. They were sticking to the words that Jesus spoke. They didn't get misled, and they were fighting against the enemy. And the enemy was no other one than Paul. All right. Okay, then in part 4 of this series, we will pick up where we left off here at location 3318 and footnote 209. And so God bless. Take care, everybody. Ciao. Bye.